Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host, David Fuhr, and joining me in the studio today at Radio Free Rhinecliff is my producer, Matthew Mercier. Hello, Matthew. Joining us today from the other side of the Atlantic, deep in the heart of Austria, is one of its most notable vintners, Michael Moosbrugger, representing his Schloss Gobelsburg. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, David. It's a great honor to be with you tonight.
I have had the pleasure of meeting Michael only a handful of times in our travels, and mine to Austria and his to London and here into the U.S. I've enjoyed his wines tremendously, and the brief time I was with him, I learned a lot in a short period of time, something 20 years ago. But Michael's here to share with us some of the world's finest Grüner Veltliner, which, as we learned earlier here at Drinking on the Edge, is the signature indigenous white grape of Austria, as well a couple of examples of some stellar Rieslings that he also produces there in the Niederösterreich area of Austria, just downriver from its capital of Wien or Vienna. Michael, if you could just fill us all in a little bit about the history of Schloss Gobelsburg before your arrival, and briefly, and then more about what you are doing there and what things you've begun.
David is a very historical place. The first settlements and the first documentations on settlements are about 3,500 to 4,000 years old. It was always settled throughout Roman times, Middle Ages. It used to be a classical fortress in the 11th century. It was then rebuilt into a Renaissance castle in the 16th century, and as it looks today, it's from around 1740. And the history of this place is pretty much linked to the history of the Cistercian monks. The Cistercian monks originally came from Burgundy, and they've been spreading in the 12th century all over Europe. And the owner of Gobelsburg was founding one of these monasteries just a little bit north of the today's estate. And the monks got their first vineyards in 1171. And that's the reason why we celebrated and commemorated 3 years ago, 850 years of monastic winemaking. So basically, the monks started slow in the 12th century, and over all the centuries, they slowly developed their wine interests over a large part of Austria. And in the 18th century, during the period of the transformation to a Baroque castle, the owner went into financial troubles, and it was the period when the monks took over the property in 1740. And in the 19th century, during the time of secularization, the monks started to concentrate more and more on the Kamtal appellation, on the region, on the Danube region. And in contrary to France and Germany, where due to the outcomes of the French Revolution, all the monasteries were eliminated or privatized, in Austria, we had a very Catholic emperor's house, the result that they could continue their work, and therefore they were able to manage the estate themselves until quite recently. They basically managed the estate themselves until 1995. And in 1996, I was able to take over the responsibilities here on the estate on a long-term relationship with them. It's a 2-generation lease, so the monks are still the owners. And together with my family, we are trying to bring the estate as good as we can now into the next generation.
Wow, that's quite a tremendous thing. You're getting on 3 decades there at Gobelsburg. Were the monks commercializing wine before your arrival, or is this something that you initiated?
No, the monks started actually in the 12th century, in 1171, with the first winemaking that the Cistercian monks for many centuries until the late 18th century were quite dominating in the development of European agriculture in general. So not only corn and noble agriculture, but also wine and winemaking. There's a very simple reason behind. Monks were in these days some of the very few ones who were able to read and write. And therefore, they were the carriers of scientific research. So basically, monks were trying to find out where are the best places to grow wine. How can we improve winemaking? How can we improve the vinification processes? And all these questions, they were carried out on a scientific level. So this is the reason why monks and monasteries were so important over about so many centuries in the last 1,000 years.
I presume they were equally methodical when it came to the issues of growing wheat, or as you say, corn, and other grains, perhaps even with animal husbandry for those who are more expert in those fields of human viability. Speaking of viability, can you touch upon how Niederösterreich's terroir, specifically yours in Comtel, along with your neighbors, offers its unique position to grow the wines we'll be tasting today, most notably Grüner Veltliner? What's special about the terroir? What does it bring to the wines both generally in your area and specifically there at Gobelsburg?
When it comes to Austria in general, we are differentiating between three major areas of wine production. So the most southern parts where the typical wines in Styria are based on Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. And then, as you all know, the Danube is passing through Austria, coming from Germany and departing via Slovakia to the Black Sea. All the appellations south of the Danube are mainly concentrating on red wine production, whereas the appellations along the Danube and north of the Danube are basically white wine production areas. Now, Gobelsburg is located in what we call the Danube region. It's basically an area that is about an hour west of Vienna. And this area is a kind of a valley landscape, and it's recalled as the sweet spot for the production of Grüner Veltliner and Riesling in Austria. So some of the most significant and most famous wines are coming from this region. It's all a kind of a valley situation. You have the main valley of the Danube, and then you have the side valleys of the Danube. You have the valley of the Treisen River, the valley of the Krems River, the valley of the Kamp River. And in German, the term of Tal, a valley situation. So the term of Kamtal translates into the valley of the Kamp River. Now, valley situation implements also that we are looking to different climatical situations of the vineyard. So the more you go up in a valley, the more you gain in altitude, and the more you gain in altitude, the cooler it gets, until it's getting at some point so cold that you're reaching the end of the winemaking zone. And therefore, we are able as producers to play around with different growing areas, with different geological situations, climatical situations. And this is something that we are using actually in the expression of the typical wines of the Danube region. That is also the reason why our appellation system is quite simple to understand, because we're differentiating in three categories of wines: the wines of the regions, the wines of the villages, and the wines of the single vineyards. So it is a three-tier system that is quite common in the world of wine, and especially for wines of origin, is something that works very well for us. Why? It's very simple. Our vineyard structures quite fraction, which means that for every single vineyard, we are looking to 20, 30, 50 different producers. It's like a little bit like in Burgundy. You have 3 rows is one producer, the next 5 rows is another producer, the next 4 rows is another, and so on. It's quite a complicated system. We as an estate, we're working in 27 different single vineyards, divided into 105 different plots. So it's all kind of very complicated, but that counts basically for everyone. And so this is why an appellation system is a very natural way for us in our considerations about the typical wines of origin of our area, the regions, the villages, and the single vineyards. So this is something that is...
It's interesting. That type of structure also is shown in the Mosel, which I grew familiar with long ago, doing practicums there, and to a lesser degree in the Rheingau because it's more broad space. I would argue that when you have a river that is very circuitous and windy with rocky precipices and different points, where the ease of attracting a certain plot is very minimal, then you'll have plots which will be relegated to one person, but they're tiny. And then when you have an expanse that's more wide open, it'll be broken up amongst a number of growers from that village. So it's a very interesting way to line things up, quite different than, say, what most people are accustomed to here in North America, with broader, more wide open areas that are viable for growing wine grapes. So one thing you touched upon was the demarcation of the Danube as a point of more or less where white wine growing is at its limits and then opens up a bit more to red wines as we go further south. And there's a couple points I'd like to bring up. And the first of all is that we recently reacquainted ourselves based upon a news report I was doing about the impact of climate change on various vineyards in Central Europe. And you added measurably to my report upon that. Now, adjacent to this is that an area north of the Danube that has been not so well known for its white wine production is slowly becoming more well known because of the impact of climate change. That is, your neighbors in Czechia and Slovakia, the quality of their wines arguably has increased as well as the quantity, again, based on the change of the climate, allowing them to grow grapes as in many parts of the world are now being able to enjoy through the shifting climatic patterns. In that regard, how have these changes impacted your adjustments and your continued progress to making as fine a quality wine as you can possibly make?
Climate change is not an issue that we are concerned now just for the past 3-5 years. It's something that we are overlooking all constantly, you could say. Because the thing is that when you're talking about climate change, then you're normally talking about average numbers. However, we as winemakers, we are not living in an average, we're living always in the current situation, which means that we are facing the situation that we are looking to warmer years, to middle years, to cooler years. And these vintages are varying constantly. I'm doing this now for close to 30 years. There's no vintage that has been somehow like any other vintage before. And every year I'm wondering if there's not now one year's coming that is something that we already had before. But it's fascinating how many variations nature brings us.
But excuse me for interrupting, hasn't there though been, from what I've read and heard from many of your colleagues, hasn't there been a greater increase or a shifting where spring will come earlier and the winters will not perhaps be as severely cold as they once were, which can impact, of course, the small animals, the insects that the birds are going to be eating. And that impacts, of course, the birds coming to your vineyards at times that you don't want them there. So there's been a shift for all of this as well. There's been a greater ease of ripening red grapes, in part, but not exclusively due to...
We as winemakers, we can measure actually climate change in the way that when we're looking to flowering dates, we can see it's like a curve that's going up and down. If you're calculating a tendency line through all this data of the past 50 years, you clearly see that we get an average warming that is, and yes, sometimes it happens that you have an earlier year that you want as a winemaker, like 2024, and then then there are coming years where you have late flowering, late bud break, and all these kind of phenomena.
But like you, we've also experienced some difficulties with rains and flooding. This year you survived quite well due to some severe flooding that could have impacted the area where you are based upon, in part, rainy period and floods that happened years ago in which protections were instituted by the government there to prevent this, and it showed itself this year. So I guess what I'm asking, Michael, is has there been an aggregate increase of rain in shorter periods that can cause problems, such as what happened in much of Central Europe and this year?
Austria is climatically completely different than like the more Atlantic influenced areas.
Sure.
We are much more continental. Like in 21, you remember that in Germany, they had all the floodings in the Ahr and so on. It was a year when we had an under average in our area. And in 22, when the Rhine was on the lowest level for decades, we had about 50% more precipitation than what we normally have. It's the heavy rainfall that we experienced this year is something that I normally would not have expected actually to come, because the last time we had it in 2002, it was the wedding year of Dirk Nieport, and so they had to change all their plans and all that. But since then, the province invested quite heavily actually in measurements against sulfur measurements and all that. This year, as you already mentioned, we were quite safe, even though that we had the same amount of rainfall as more than 20 years ago. However, it doesn't mean that we will, in the future, will see more and more extreme weather phenomena coming along. However, what I want to say is that at the end of the day, we are living in the current moment, and we always have to deal with the current situation. If we have a lot of water, then we have to react properly that we have a lot of water. And if we have a drought, then we have to react properly that we have a drought. And I think this is the nature of a winemaker, that we need to be adaptable. We need to be able to improvise. I used to be a jazz musician when I was in my school days. So it's something that seems to be naturally for my natural, that I can cope with certain situations and to make the best out of it.
Yeah. If you're a jazz lover, as I'm sure you still are, it's worth mentioning a nod out to Q, Quincy Jones, who just passed on. I was listening to a
I was very sorry to hear, because Quincy Jones was a really hero for us, and there's so many good memories starting in the 60s up to all the recordings that that he was producing then later on, but really always fantastic music in whatever field he was.
Everybody from Frank Sinatra to Michael Jackson and everybody in between. Yeah. I was listening to a podcast with him, Teva Smiley, talking about Q with Dr. Cornel West. Back to our business here, moving away from climate change. Thank you for indulging me there a little bit. So let's talk about Grüner Veltliner. We've here Drinking on the Edge. We've recently done 2 episodes on Grüner Veltliner, but with U.S. domestic production. Vintners on the eastern part of the U.S. and then vintners in the western part of the U.S. We're a little bit backwards. We probably should have started with you and then moved on to the U.S., but whatever. We're just having fun here. Talk a little bit, if you could, about Grüner Veltliner's viability with your terroir. It's what you find its unique organoleptic characteristics, its growing capacity as a viticulturalist, and then possibly a little bit about its suitability to your national cuisine.
The grape variety of Grüner Veltliner became a kind of a national identity, I could say. Its Austrians have a great pride, actually, in this grape variety.
As well, they should.
It has been serving in difficult times. It has been serving to the good of a lot of producers. However, we need to understand that Grüner Veltliner is not Grüner Veltliner. When talking about, we're producing quite a huge range of different wines in our portfolio, and when we're going from the lighter styles of Grüner Veltliner, the regional styles, so we're going to the village wines, to go to the expressions of the different single vineyard wines. So the spectrum of expressions of this grape variety is quite huge. I think some grape varieties are quite close in their spectrum, in their typical expressions. But Grüner Veltliner is a grape variety that offers quite a big range of different possibilities, expressions, beside the fact that there are groups of Grüner Veltliner that can be also quite different in the spicy expressions, in the aromatical expressions. Some of those selections, they have a little bit more kind of a Sauvignon attitude. This is something that we normally in the Danube region do not find so often, but it can happen, actually. And this is why I'm often asked by Master of Wine students or Master Sommelier students, how can we identify Grüner Veltliner in a blind tasting? And I always say it's really a challenge, because there are so many different ways of expressions that it doesn't make life easier for those students. So this is in Austria, it's often described, it's about the pepperiness that is explained about this grape variety. Honestly, I think this is all bullshit, because I've never tasted really actually something that reminds me in any way to pepperiness on these wines. And honestly, I believe it was a kind of a marketing idea in the 1980s, because in these days, the Austrian Wine Marketing Board needed something very easy to access or something imaginative to describe this grape variety or the taste of this grape variety. And I'm not really sure if it was a really wise idea actually to go for this idea of the pepperiness of this grape variety. Of course, it was something special, but I'm not really sure if it really meets reality.
I could supplant that pepperiness with vivaciousness, perhaps. There's a certain liveliness that is indicative of a great many, especially younger Grüner Veltliners. Speaking of which, I've just poured for Matthew and I a taste of your 2023 Gobelsburg Grüner Veltliner from Kamptal. And Kamptal is your particular district of your area. Can you share how does your terroir in Kamptal differ from or resemble that of your nearby neighbors of equally well-known Kremstal and Wachau?
First of all, it's always a question that we are asked internationally. What is the difference? Kamptal, Tristal, Wachau. And honestly, I always try to explain that I believe that the differences within the appellations are much more significant than the differences between the appellations. Why? First of all, let's talk about terroir. Let's talk about the soils, the geology.
Please.
This is something that you find in the Danube region. You find three major structures. First of all, you have the fundament of the whole area, which is a remaining part of the so-called Berchtesgaden Mountains. There used to be 600 million years ago, there used to be a mountainside up to 8,000 meters. And over all the millions of years, this mountainside is now today completely eroded. And the only thing that is left over is the lowest part of it, the stumps, basically, of this mountainside. So you find parts of that mountainside throughout Europe. So the Bohemian Mass is a part of it. And in Germany, the Eifel, in France, Massif Central, southern parts of England, even the Appalachians actually belong to this period. And the Danube region is based on this Bohemian Mass. It's a plate called the Gföhler Gneis plate, which is going throughout whole Wachau, Kremstal, Kamptal. So this is the geological basement. The second structure that you find in the area is tertiary structures. The Danube was not always as regulated as today. So in the past 60 millions of years, the Danube went through completely different areas and has been depositing material from the Alps and from the northern parts. So the tertiary structures that you find in all of these areas. The third component is löss. Löss is an element that's coming from the Alps, coming during the glacier time when the glaciers are going over rocks, sharpening up tiny particles from the rocks, which are washed out by the water. And at the end of the glacier, this material can be easily picked up by winds and is transported then in our area, is deposited according to the overall structures that you find in our area. So it's also a structure that you find in all of these appellations. In fact, until 1963, this area used to be united. So until 1963, basically everything was Wachau. And then in 1963, they had political quarrels with the results that it was decided to split up the area, which is leading to the fact that we have now to explain actually what is the difference and what is the common things. Now, the reason that I believe that the differences within the appellations are so significant is that we're all talking about valley situation. So all of these appellations are valleys. Tristal, Kremstal, Kamptal, Wachau, they're all valley situation. Now, as I already explained before, that the more you go up in the valley, the more you gain in altitude, and the more you gain in altitude, the cooler it gets, is leading to the point where it's getting too cold for winemaking. So comparing now the lower part of the valley to the upper part of the valley, no matter in which appellation, brings you to a difference in harvest time of about 3 weeks.
As far as a range between the far end and the two far ends, yeah.
So for example, comparing Leuven to Spitz on the upper end, Spitzelgraben, so it's about 3 weeks in harvest time in between. The same phenomenon you have in the Kremstal between Krems and Senftenberg, where Nigel is located, for example. And the same phenomenon you have in the Kamptal between Gobelsburg or Langenlois and the upper end, which is Schönberg, comparing now the wines from there. You have the same difference as in the Wachau and the Kremstal and so on. So these differences, they're quite significant. And the difference between producers like Knoll or FX Pichler to Hirzberger, you find the same differences between producers in the Kremstal, between Salomon and Nigel, for example, or also in the Kamptal in the same way. So that makes the explanation kind of difficult. However, I think you will find great wines in all of these areas, and there's good reason actually to say that the Danube in general is basically a kind of a sweet spot for Austrian wines based on these two grape varieties, Grüner Veltliner and Riesling. We've not been talking about why there are two grape varieties, Grüner Veltliner and Riesling.
We just started tasting the Grüner Veltliner, and it's, again, as far as this is an entry, I guess you call it a level of village wine that you have, the Goebelsbrück, eh?
No, I do not call it as an entry. I call it a regional wine.
That's a regional wine, excuse me.
So
it's a Comtal regional wine, yeah.
Exactly. What is a regional wine? Now, you have, with all what I already mentioned, when you're having the intention to produce a regional expression of such a valley situation, you have to take into account all the different aspects of the valley. So we're taking account the lower parts of the valley as well as the upper part of the valley, the different soil constructions. So it's, first of all, there's the different soil and climatical conditions that we're taking account. But beside that, we also take into account the cultural aspects. I'm coming now back to what we were asking before about the implementations on food and enjoyment of Austrian wine. Now, this is something that is quite important actually to understand the typicity of these wines, because it's not only the soil and the climate that is forming actually the structure of these wines. It is also the question on how we enjoy these kind of wines and what we are doing actually with them.
Of course. And I would argue the intervention of the human who is working with those vines to the point where if all these wonderful, notable vintners that you mentioned are sharing a rather large parcel of land together, the expression of how each one of these men or women are making these wines back when they take the grapes to the winery, plus what they're doing in the vineyard in particular, will showcase pretty clearly what their intention is as far as the expression of the land and the climate through those grapes, because their neighbors' wines were the next ones over, perhaps. So that if you are comparing one to the other, that's a great way to see how your wines differ from your neighbors' wines, etc.
Exactly. We can look at that from that angle, but we can also look at it from a different angle, because a different angle would be that, of course, we can consider actually about what are the differences between the wines, but we also can consider what are the common aspects about these wines. And the thing is that when you're working, because appellations implement that you are basically working together as a collective. And the thing is that we are acting as a winemaker. We are not acting completely separated from our neighbors and from our colleagues. We meeting them in the vineyard. We taste our wines together. We're discussing certain aspects in the vinification process that influences us in our way of behavior. And this is why I have a strong belief that the typical expressions is not only actually the expression of one producer, it is always an expression of a kind of a collective.
A culture.
And that is called culture, exactly. So the culture of winemaking in an area is quite significant. And I have to say, in certain aspects, you find already certain differences in behavior, differences between Kamtal and Wachau, for example. And when I said before that we are more common than different, there is some aspects that differentiates us a little bit from each other. But these are a little bit more the shades of gray, and that brings more the spices actually into the areal differences.
Yeah,
now,
where does terroir begin and culture end, so to speak?
Exactly. So what is a classically Kamtal wine? So I would define it as a light to medium-bodied wine. It's a wine between 11 to 12.5 alcohol. It's a dry wine, and it's a wine that has a nice and decent aroma, but it's not a wine that is too aromatic. In fact, actually, we don't want that these wines are too aromatic. Intentionally, we ferment these wines with a rather higher temperature in order to keep the aromas a little bit down. Why are we doing that? Normally, you would imagine that winemakers are trying to make the wines as expressive as possible. But however, And here comes now the cultural aspect. The biggest part of these wines are enjoyed together with food. Now, considering about what is the Austrian-Hungarian, the Austrian cuisine. The Austrian cuisine is originating in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. During a period when the northern parts of Italy were part of Austria, when the Balkan countries were part of Austria, Hungary, the western part of Ukraine, the Bohemian country.
And Wien was a melting pot of these cultures to share their ideas and their cuisine.
Yeah, and Vienna was like New York today. It was everything, everyone was coming to Vienna, and it was a huge melting pot. And if you're looking to Austrian cuisine today, it's a nose to tail cuisine, and we still eat all the inner parts of the animals. It's a cuisine that, especially when we're having supper within the family, it's a family style eating. We have different dishes on the table with different flavors, with different textures. So the outcome and the result is that we need somehow wines that somehow go with all these different things. This is why we intentionally do not like actually that the wines are too aromatic. As there's a very simple rule for sommeliers, which says the more aromatic a wine is, the more precise you have to be in matching food and wine.
Sure.
And in the contrary, the less aromatic a wine is, the more universal he gets in his use. So this is quite important for the sommelier, because in the life of the sommelier, there's a perfect life and then there's an imperfect. The perfect life is he has a table in front of him. Everyone's eating the same thing, so he can make a perfect combination for every dish that's coming on the table. So this is where he can show his abilities. Here he can show what his cellar has to offer, and here he can create the sensation for his clients. That's the perfect life for the sommelier.
This would extend as well to the person at home, and I would say that's also true. But it's also important that the wines not be so reticent in their aromas, so that they disappear. You can't understand, you can't smell what the wines are. That said, I've gone and poured myself a taste of your Riesling, your first Riesling here, the Zübing, which is a village wine, correct? Or are we still talking about, okay, it is a village wine. And this is a 2022. So we've moved from the Grüner Veltliner from 2023 to the Riesling from 2022 Zübing. And so again, at least this first Grüner as well as this first Riesling, they're not shy, but they're not exactly very expressive. Could be because they're young, don't know. But these two certainly reflect what your comments were about the wines not being too expressive.
And so this is the reason why we need these wines to be very universal in its use. And so this is a part actually of the expression of this wine. Now, Zübing is now a village that is a bit more to the north located. It's in the middle part of the valley, and it's dominated by vineyards that are based on terraces. I started before to talk about two grape varieties of Grüner Veltliner and Riesling. Now, for all of you, when you come to the Danube region, you instantly identify two general types of vineyard size. So first of all, you have the terraced vineyards, so vineyards that are very dry, high mineralization, ideal for the production of the grape of Riesling. On the other side, the vineyards based on loess on clay, which have a good water supply to the wines, which is ideal for the grape variety Grüner Veltliner. Now, the two grape varieties, they're complementary. What one likes, the other doesn't like, and the other way around. And as we have those two opposing structures, we need the two grape varieties to cover the needs of the vineyards. Now, Zübing, the village of Zübing, is now dominated by terraced vineyards. So this is why the village wine of Zübing is a wine that is based on Riesling grapes. And we will taste later on the very famous Zübinger Heiligenstein, which is one of the most iconic vineyards of Austria. But there are others that are even well known, Zübinger Kogelberg, Pfaffenberg, Geisberg. They're all vineyards that are based on terraced vineyards and are a part actually of that typical expression from this vintage.
Curious, many people talk about wine sustainability issues, organic growing issues. What challenges do you and your fellow vintners there face in attempting to grow organically?
In the Kamptal appellation, we have a strong approach towards ecological questions. In the new Kamptal appellation laws, it is defined that all Kamptal wine needs to be either biological or sustainable certified. We had very strong debates actually on that question, but this strong commitment now to these kind of ecological questions for the future is a part of the DNA of the company. Austria in general is quite advanced actually in all these approaches. In the meantime, we have about already a little bit more than 40% of the overall production in Austria that is either biological, biodynamic, sustainable production. You can see, I think we are number one actually in Europe actually with these kind of approaches.
In terms of, so yes, I just poured this Steinsetz 2022 Grüner Veltliner, and in comparison to the Gobelsburg, the nose, it's a 2022, but the smell is a little bit more expressive, a little bit more round, less delicate to my sense.
Steinsetz is a vineyard that is located south of the castle. It's based on an old side river bed of the original Danube. So we have sandy structures, a little bit smaller pebbles. It's a vineyard that is quite unusual in the context of the Kamptal appellation. This is the reason why we vinify this vineyard separately, because it has a strong personality. It's a vineyard that is on one side quite strong actually in that kind of personal expression, but on the other side, it's not a vineyard that we are considering as being one of the most significant 20% of the area. So it's a non-classified vineyard, comparable to a UD in Burgundy. This is the reason why we vinify it also separately. It's a wine that we enjoy quite often actually in our family life. Why? Because it's a typical wine that we enjoy for the classical Austrian cuisine. It's a wine for the classical Wiener Schnitzel, Tafelspitz, the very classical dishes that if we are going as a family into the classical restaurants in Austria, then this is something that we would enjoy there. It has a medium-bodied, it's a little bit stronger, a little bit broader shoulder, can withhold these kind of dishes.
And a bit more of a powerful finish, I would say, and it lingers a little bit longer, certainly than the Gobelsburg, which is a more delicate, lighter, easier drinking style. I would say that if I was having some fresh fish from the Danube that's there, I would opt for the Gobelsburg, whereas I agree with you, the Wiener Schnitzel would be more appropriate with the Steinsetz. So lighter, light freshwater fish with the Gobelsburg to be sure. It was just reported, I don't know if you saw the news feeds for the wine business, the governing body for wine internationally, it just came up with I don't know if it's a final decision, but it's a directorate perhaps, about the issue of vine age, what constitutes old grapevines. And so there's a vine age issue is like 35 years, they've said, is a good ideal amount of time by which the scion should be connected with the grafted vine. Minimum number of age to call the vine an old vine. And then also they made a decision with regards to how this should be reflected in an overall vineyard site. That said, how do you feel? What's your experience with vine age impacting the quality or the volume of a wine's expression via the vine?
I think we need to differentiate what is scientific results and what is communication of winemakers. Because the age of wine is something that we winemakers love. We really love, because we can go to the extremes. We asking 3 winemakers how old his wines are, then one is starting with 40 years, the second one will continue with 50 years, and the third one will end up with 60 years. It's a kind of it's an aspect that we tend to exaggerate a little bit, because the idea what is the principal idea behind? The principal idea is that the older the wine, the smaller the berries, the more concentration, the more aromatics or whatsoever. So this is the implementation idea of old wines. Scientifically, we have clear results actually to that question. Geisenheim has a vineyard.
By Geisenheim, you're referring to the famous wine school in the Rheingau region of Germany.
University and wine school in Germany, in the Rheingau. They made scientific researches actually on that question. And they have a vineyard that has the exact genetical material, with a plot that is 60 years old, a plot that is 25 years old, and a plot that is 5 years old. And they made this comparison now, what's happening now over the years. And what they found was there are really significant differences between 5 and 25 years. However, there's no difference between 25 years and 60 years. And honestly, I'm a little bit shy actually on when someone is asking about the age of the wines, because it's always leading that we are flirting with certain ideas about the age of our wines. The thing is that for me, the most important actually about our oldest vineyards is not so much the age of these wines, it's more the genetical pool actually that is behind these vineyards. Because these vineyards were planted during a period when the monks did the crafting still themselves. And here we have genetical material that is really linked to our history of the estate. It's a material, it's a genetical selection that was selected over generations within the estate. And this has a little bit more value actually as the question of age of wines. And in that respect, that's a little bit more important for me.
Okay. And we briefly passed over the idea of red grapes, and though I haven't any of your examples with me here today, the fine folks at Skurnik helped to facilitate my receiving these terrific Riesling Grüner Veltliner, but there's no red wines here. Though you produce some and you export here some to the U.S., can you talk just a little bit about the red grapes and the red wine that you produce?
The Danube region is a predominantly white wine producing area. However, we have a small percentage of vineyards that are based on old river sedimentation structures. The Danube went through completely different areas in the past millions of years, and so we have a few vineyards that are based on the feast-sized river pebbles, like you would find them in the Rhone Valley, like the Galliole. And these vineyards, they have a good drainage in the soil, so water's running away, with the result that you're running into early dry stress situation over the summer month. And this is something that we don't like at all for white wine production. So in these vineyards, we're going then for red wine, mainly based on the Pinot grape variety and the family of Pinot Noir. We are a Cistercian estate, so the monks brought at some stage Pinot to our area, and therefore we have an old tradition actually in Pinot producing. But today, we're looking, beside Pinot Noir, we are looking after St. Laurent, and also Zweigelt. So basically, these are the three generations in our area.
Well, I do encourage people to seek them out along with your other wines. And you do make some sparkling wine. It's worth a mention, if not for the season that we're entering into now, that sparkling wines are going to be more consumed. And you do make some very good ones. Not a lot, but still white wines is your forte. I've just poured myself a taste of the Heiligenstein 2021 Riesling. And this has after Heiligenstein, it has a number 1 and then an ER. It's just number 1 after it and a symbol. So what does that number 1 indicate?
Now, this symbol is basically indicating that we're talking about a classified vineyard. It's a classified vineyard by the Association of Österreichische Traditionsweingüter. So it's the traditional Austrian wineries. And it's an association that was founded in 1991 with the primary goal to establish a vineyard classification system for the vineyards of Austria. And
not so dissimilar to what they have in Bordeaux with the various Grand Cru, in Burgundy the various levels of wine quality and so on.
Exactly. Well, however, the interesting thing is that they decided in the early 90s already to go for vineyard classification, like in the way that they have it in Burgundy, during a period when Burgundy was completely unpopular, because it was considered to be unreliable, inconsistent, and all that, even though they decided to go for classification in the sense of Burgundy. And the interesting thing is that as there is no recipe to how you can do a vineyard classification system, we had to develop our own systematics about the classification. And even though that the government and the wine politics were in the beginning were quite opposing to that idea of vineyard classification, 10 years ago they became more and more interested actually in the concept. And over a period of 10 years, there was an expert group trying to find out how we could implement actually all this systematic into the legislation of Austria. And last year, the Minister of Agriculture signed the law for the implementation of the classification for the vineyards of Austria. So Austria became now the first country outside of France with a legal classification system. And this is quite something that is quite new that we are still working on. So there's a lot of implementations on that.
I do recall there was some efforts being made going back to the 19th century under the Habsburg Empire to classify the various vineyards. It didn't go to the extent that perhaps they did in Germany and in France, but there was some some success, though it wasn't necessarily implemented under Austrian wine law, again, until you mentioned the 1990s. Eh?
Yes, these movements are always historical, worthwhile looking at. So it's always good to have an indication, but it's not the only thing that counts. In the same way as in Germany, also in the VDP, they did not take one-to-one the classification of Napoleon into their classification. So it's an indication for today's classification, but it's not the whole story, basically. I think we need to look at other factors, relevance factors that are even important than that. And we don't have the time actually now to go into details actually on that, because that would be an own podcast, I think.
But let's go back to Heiligenstein, beautifully named for this parcel. And this Riesling is certainly more precise and more complex than the Zubing we tasted earlier. Again, an expression of this top site.
Literally translated, it's the Rock of the Saints.
Yeah.
The vineyard is an icon in Austria. It's one of the most famous vineyards. Has many reasons, historically reasons. It was already 20,000 years. It was used for hunting purposes. So this is why it was called Hellenstein in the beginning, in the 11th, 12th century, transformed into Heiligenstein because the wines were used to finance a hospital. And then it became the first vineyard that was sold as a single vineyard wine in Austria because the emperor built the railroad through the Campbell to the north, which brought tourism to the area. And suddenly the vineyard, which is a kind of a landmark in the area, became even more known than the village of Zöbing. This is why the growers started to sell the wines under the name of Heiligenstein instead of Zöbing, which would be normal at that time.
Sure.
Now, but there's another reason actually why Heiligenstein is so famous, because it's a geological island. It's not primary rock. What do you find on Heiligenstein? It's Permian soil. So it's a crystalline structure that was mixed up with volcanic elements and other things, was compressed to a rock structure, and has a singularity actually when it comes to the geological structure. And this is why Heiligenstein, I would define it not as better than all the other vineyard sites, but it's significantly different. And this is something that makes Heiligenstein so special.
Before we conclude here, you have lastly a bottle that looks from the label and the presentation of the bottle itself, very different from the previous four wines. It says tradition, and it says it's a cuvée of 3 years. And having looked on the back, I know it's a Grüner Veltliner. Can you share with us what looks to be edition 851? This is a very different label than the rest. I think you had something to do with this with the creation of this concept as well.
We've been tasting so far wines of appellation, and this is the core production of what we do at Gobelsburg. And we have been already talking about a few specialties that we do besides the wines of appellation, which is the red wines, the sparkling wines. We're doing a little bit of sweet wines. And the fourth specialty is historically winemaking. When I took over the responsibilities in 1996, and after I took over, I started to find out about the history of this place. And I was standing in the cellar and I thought, but how did my predecessors been working here in this cellar? And in the late 90s, I started trying to find out how was wine made in the Greek-Roman times. I went to the Mosel, to Peaceport to see the press houses there. Tried to find out how was wine made in the Middle Ages, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And in 2001, I decided to go for a project that is related to the early 19th century winemaking. So the time period between the French Revolution and the mid-19th century. And the reason is that this period is quite particular in the context of the history of winemaking, because it's a period that on one side looks back to an empirical knowledge of 2,000 years of winemaking. But on the other side, it's a period that is not yet influenced by the outcomes of industrialization. It's starting around 1850 that winemakers and scientists are posing the very classical industrial question: how can we produce wine in bigger quantities and in a shorter period of time? And this question is leading to some new innovations, like the first filtration machines were invented around 1850. New pressing systems were invented.
Refrigeration systems.
Exactly. There was a whole development when it comes to technologization of the vinification process. And all these machines, they're basically leading to a change in the craftsmanship side of winemaking. And it's leading to what we are calling today modern winemaking. And you can look to the differences between the wines of 200 years ago from different angles. On one side, how was the actual process? How was it done? What was the craftsmanship side and the manipulations and all that? But on the other side, it's also the attitude and the general philosophy that also changed in this period. Because in these days, they had a completely different idea about what is wine. Now, asking today a winemaker about his philosophy, you are ending up very, very quickly with the low or non-intervention ideology, trying to leave everything away as much as possible. But asking a winemaker 200 years ago about his ideas about winemaking, he would probably express that he would compare wine rather to us as human beings. They said wine is a little bit like us. And in the same way as we humans, when we are born, have to undergo certain developments until we are grown-ups, also wine has to undergo certain developments until he comes to his maturity. And in the same as we humans have to breathe, also wine needs to breathe to do all these developments. And this was the reason why they thought we need to let the wine breathe from time to time in order to trigger now the next step of the development process. And this process was called the teaching of the wine. So basically, technically, they have been racking the wines from cask to cask in order to let the wine breathe again and to get off the lees as fast as possible. Now, winemaking in the 19th century is basically oxidative winemaking. The most significant wine styles of the 19th century, they were all oxidative wine styles. The same way also here in the Danube region, which means that also my role as a cellar, in these days I was the cellar master. And my responsibility was basically to identify the potentials of the wine and to educate him right, that he would develop up to his potentials. And this was called the teaching of the wine. This was called Elevage, die Schulung des Weines. So this is basically, and the thing is that Schloss Gobelsberg is an estate with a history of so many hundreds of years. I think that we have a certain responsibility to not completely forget actually what our predecessors did in the past centuries. And
so this Tradition 2019 Grüner Veltliner is your attempt to reflect the centuries behind you that brought you here today.
It's basically a reflection of the winemaking of the early 19th century, of the winemaking 200 years ago. And it's reflecting certain ideas and practices actually of these days. For example, it was not only one grape variety, because here we have not only Grüner Veltliner, but there's also Riesling involved. It's a Veltliner and Riesling cuvée, basically. And it's a multi-vintage cuvée, so the 3 years is indicating the youngest part of the wine. So it's vintage 19, 17, and 16 that we have been using actually for the tradition. I started early in 2009, I started to build up reserves in order to be able to create this kind of vintage cuvées. And beside the 3-year tradition, we're doing also a 10-year tradition. And in special years, we're doing then special wines. 3 years ago, in the context of the 850 years, we created a 50-year tradition where we were using wines from the library in order to create a wine that was built or was made actually from wines of the past 50 years.
It's incredible, Michael. It's great you've taken the time and the knowledge to apply to this last unique expression of the Schloss Gobelsberg wines. Before we finish off here from the Hudson Tal to the Kamptal, can you please, for the uninitiated, not the wine professional, to know this, if they're going to be going to visiting Wien or Vienna, it's such a short journey by car or train to you, between 30 and 60 minutes, depending on how you do it. I would suggest staying off the big road and take the small roads. But 45 minutes to the opera for you, how convenient. So what, other than your amazing wines and those of your colleagues and the foods that people are going to be enjoying there, what other delights can await the visitor to your little corner of the Donau?
First of all, Vienna in Austria is a cultural hotspot. Because the opera, to the concert houses, to the museums, this is world class, and it's always worthwhile visiting and staying a few days in Vienna.
Oh, absolutely.
Beside that, Vienna is
But what about you in particular? I'm sorry, I'm speaking about the village. Vienna has been much, you can find all you want about Vienna in any media outlet. But what about leaving the city and coming to you in the countryside, shall we say, down the river a bit? What awaits people there besides the beautiful vineyards, the beautiful wines, and the views of the Danube? What can people do?
What is very famous in our area is cycling. So it's one of the most famous cycling tours is coming from Passau, from Germany, all the Danube along, then to Vienna or Bratislava. So you find a lot of them visiting the old villages and castles along the Danube. It's also something that is fantastic. Krems is a hotspot. It's a beautiful small village and offers many possibilities to stay there, to enjoy a few days. It's a beautiful area. Feel free to come and see Schloss Gobelsburg, of course. So we're also open to the public, and we are hosting visitors and showing the cellar facilities to wine lovers and doing tastings and all that. And then there are also fantastic restaurants.
Yeah, I agree. I've only been to your area a few times. I look forward to going again. For those of you who are looking for Michael's wines, they're available throughout the United States and in a great number of countries around the world for our international listeners, and we do have some. If you want to learn more, go online to gobelsburg.at. It's in English and German, of course. Any other languages, people can find it.
It's just English and German.
Okay, English and German it is. Michael Moosbrugger, thank you very much for joining Drinking on the Edge. Congratulations on another successful harvest. I wish you luck in your impending tour of Asia, and thanks again.
Thank you, David. It was a great pleasure.